I want to bring on our first guest. Lee Fang is an award-winning investigative journalist who has written for The Intercept, The Nation, Think Progress, and Republic Report. He currently publishes his investigative work on his Substack newsletter, which you can subscribe to at leefang.com. Hey, Lee, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you wrote this article. This is interesting because I'm involved in it, smearing pro-peace voices. And so what's going on is, well, here's America is funding, taxpayer dollars are funding these pro-war outlets. One of them is Vox Ukraine. And Vox Ukraine did a bunch of these videos. I'm in one of them. Look, there it is. And these are in Ukrainian. There's Russell Brand. I think that's the ex-CIA guy. I can't think of his name. But anyway, they're doing a bunch of them. So you wrote an article about this. U.S. taxpayers' dollars are flowing to outlets such as New Voice of Ukraine, Vox Ukraine, Detector Media, the Institute of Mass Information, the Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine, and many others. Some of this money's come from the $44.1 billion in civilian needs foreign aid committed to Ukraine. So now here's a little bit of the video they did on me. I'll just play a little bit of it.
Jimmy Dore, американський стендап-комік.
So I liked how she says my name. Jimmy Dore, but she's saying that first of all, she says here, if you read, I have it translated. It says Jimmy Dore. You can turn her down for a second. Jimmy Dore is a stand-up comedian, political commentator, podcaster, and simply a conspiracy theorist, i.e. a person who believes in conspiracy theories and tends to believe that behind events or situations, there are hidden motives that may not be apparent or obvious to others. Yeah, that's called life. That's called it's hilarious. That is the most favorable definition of a conspiracy theorist I've ever heard in my life. That's exactly what we do here. We find the hidden motives. We get to what's really happening. You know, when they tell you that it's safe and effective, we actually look into it. When they tell you that we're going to bomb Iraq because they have weapons of mass destruction, we actually look into that. Turns out that was a big conspiracy. So here's what they say. And then they try to discredit me by saying that I talked about microchips and vaccines against the coronavirus. And I never did that. And the reason why they don't show that clip is because I never did that. What I did show is that the head of Pfizer said they are putting their own microchips in pills that they are giving people. And he said, imagine the compliance. That's what really caught my eye. But anyway, and so they're saying we distorted him saying that. Well, we didn't. So this is the kind of stuff. Another conspiracy theory promoted my Dore. First of all, they're Dore with one R. That's a different R. That's the different comedian. This is a guy out of Boston or something like that. He's big on conspiracy theorists, the other Jimmy Dore. I only deal in conspiracy facts. So here we go. The Syrian government did not attack with chemical weapons the opposition-held city of King Shakun in Syria, where a large number of civilians died. But so they're still pushing that lie that Assad gassed his own people. So this is the propaganda that U.S. taxpayers' money is being used for, right? They're sending it to Vox, that garbage news outlet. Now it's Vox Ukraine. And so it goes on, but at least they got an attractive lady to say it. And I think she's showing a little cleavage, which is nice. While the funding is officially billed as an ambitious program to develop high-quality independent news programs, counter malign Russian influence, and modernize Ukraine's archaic media laws, the news sites, in many cases, have promoted aggressive messages that stray from traditional journalistic practices to promote the Ukrainian government's official positions and delegitimize its critics. So that's exactly what your taxpayers are being used for. Vox Ukraine has released highly produced videos attacking the credibility of American opposition voices, including Jeffrey Sachs, Mersheimer, and Glenn Greenwald. Detector Media, one of the most influential media watchdog groups, similarly produces a flow of social media and posts branding American critics of the war as part of a Russian disinformation. That's what everybody does. And not only Vox Ukraine, but, everybody from Vox Ukraine to Joe Biden. Ro-Khanna. Anybody who says the truth about what's happening in Ukraine, they say it's Russian disinformation. You're working for the Russians. Just like if you question weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, they said you were working for Assad. Same thing with Libya. Same thing with Syria. It never stops. And so this is the exact same thing they're doing. But the thing is, you're paying for it. It's not only dissident voices targeted by the USAID funded groups. Detector Media went after the New York Times after a news report about hundreds of Ukrainians in the Battle of Avdiivka who were captured or missing. The Ukrainian fact-check site offered little in terms of rebuttal. So they didn't have any facts to give you. What did they do? They just labeled it as disinformation. The New Voice of Ukraine quoted a Ukrainian official describing the Times story as a Russian psyop. That's all they do. So but here's even more. The New Voice of Ukraine syndicates with Yahoo News. Vox Ukraine is a fact-checking partner with Meta. That's Facebook. So now you know why all my old Hollywood friends hate me, because they go on Facebook and they see my videos up on Facebook that are accurate, and then Meta teams up with a propaganda firm like this, or a Bill Gates funded propaganda fact-checking organization, or somebody like Snopes, who the head of Snopes had to resign because he got caught being a serial plagiarist. And then they say I'm spreading misinformation, but of course that's just propaganda. And then so that's there to discredit me, and it works with a lot of people. Not everybody, thank God. So Detector Media has similarly led a consortium of nonprofit groups pressuring social media platforms to aggressively remove content critical. So that's what they do. I had a couple of videos taken down on YouTube. Facebook has demonetized me. They've banned everything except completely kicked us off of Facebook. Congress is now weighing a new supplemental funding measure with approximately $60 billion earmarked for the war in Ukraine. A small portion of the emergency spending package is devoted to continued USAID programming in the country, but far less. So here's another thing. They always talk about how Russia is shutting down their journalists, but what gets less attention is how the Ukraine government's crackdown on its independent and opposition media, a push aided by the U.S.-backed network of anti-disinformation groups. Even as Washington's efforts to censor information at home is drawing greater scrutiny, its support of Ukraine's effort reflects the increasingly global reach of the American government's propaganda arms. So get this. So what do they consider what do they consider what is disinformation or misinformation, and they want to pressure social media to censor it? Well, in response to questions about the U.S.-backed anti-disinformation groups in Ukraine targeting Americans, the U.S. State Department provided a statement saying it defines disinformation as, quote, false or misleading information that is deliberately created or spread with the intent to deceive or mislead. Okay, that almost seems fair. It added, we accept there may be other interpretations or definitions. Oh, really? Wait till you find out what those other ones are. And we do not censor or coerce independent organizations into adopting our definition. The length of the report defines disinformation as not only false or misleading content, but also verifiable information, which they say is unbalanced or skewed, amplifies or exaggerates certain elements for effect, or uses emotive or inflammatory language to achieve effects which fit within existing Kremlin narratives, aims, or activities. So in other words, factual information with emotional language that simply overlaps with anything remotely connected to Russian viewpoints is considered disinformation, according to the U.S.-backed consulting firm helping to guide the efforts of Ukrainian think tanks and media. And so let me bring in Lee. Now, Lee, this is quite an article, and it's a great read. Everybody should check it out. There's a lot of information that I don't have time to share on the show. But what is your reaction to learning all this information?
Well, I'm not shocked. I've written about disinformation and these kind of speech wars in the domestic context that oftentimes the U.S. government and powerful interest groups have sought to control the flow of information and discourse by creating NGOs and other third parties, or working with academic third parties to create kind of a criteria for disinformation and misinformation, which are very powerful terms now. And through those appendages, they censor dissenting speech, critical speech. They use that kind of to force compliance in the discourse. So in that context, I'm not surprised. But this is interesting because there is a wider debate here in the West, in the U.S., about the authoritarian nature of Russia. That Russia has cracked down on journalists and independent media. They've arrested journalists, and that's true. That's a gigantic controversy that I'm concerned with. But there hasn't been scrutiny on these draconian moves by Ukraine. That the Ukrainian government, through President Zelensky, has banned opposition media, has arrested journalists, has really cracked down on free speech and free expression in that country. And as I kind of peel back the layers, looking at USAID and other contracts, it really startled me to see the level of U.S. involvement in this crackdown on free speech and on independent media. And beyond that, there's an additional layer here that you just described, that unlike, there's similar contractors worked for USAID in the reconstruction of Iraq and Afghanistan. We were very involved in making Iraqi newspapers and magazines and websites, and same thing with Afghanistan. But what's unique here is that a lot of the Ukrainian think tanks and media are very influential for shaping the discourse back at home. They're publishing English language content. They're working with Facebook to censor social media, and they're actually affecting potentially American foreign policy because they're going after critics like yourself, like John Mearsheimer, like Glenn Greenwald. These are very prominent voices, some of the only voices that are really critical of the mainstream narrative around NATO or around this U.S. involvement in the war. And so it kind of creates a vicious feedback loop of the American taxpayer money is going to groups that are censoring Americans who are dissidents on this war.
Yeah, that's the amazing part to me, is that these people are the ones who are we're anybody who calls himself a fact checker or a professional fact checker, they're not. Okay. Those are just people who are being funded by a billionaire or a government somewhere to lie to you and to squelch the truth, right? So we as I was talking with Russell last night, people like you, people like Glenn Greenwald, the Gray Zone, this show, we're the new what Rolling Stone used to be in the 60s. That's what we are today, right? And so I just want to show a few more examples of what they consider to be misinformation. All you have to do is say that Ukraine is being used as a pawn in a proxy war against Russia. That's considered, that will be flagged. They will pressure social media sites to take that down. Ukraine's government has also worked with U.S. government officials and others to censor its American critics. One prominent example, Aaron Mate, friend of the show, Aaron Mate, frequent guest host of the show. He's an independent journalist who has criticized U.S. policy regarding Ukraine in other outlets. So can you tell us what they did with Aaron Mate?
I mean, this is incredible. They did quite a lot with Aaron Mate, but one example is that the FBI works very closely with the Ukrainian top intelligence agency, that's SBU, the Secret Service of Ukraine. In the first few weeks of the war, Russia's invasion, the Ukrainian Secret Service forwarded a list of problematic social media accounts of people they accused of being Russian propagandists or involved in Russian disinformation to the FBI, which used as kind of in-house contacts with the major social media firms, including Twitter, to go after even American journalists. One of them was Aaron Mate, who was incredibly credible, very thorough journalist who has really spoken out against the mainstream narrative on a lot of these foreign policy issues. In addition to that,
Aaron Mate has won awards for his meticulous debunking of American propaganda. The biggest award he got was around Russiagate, and it was, in fact, that's the words they used, his meticulous debunking of Russiagate. So he's thorough, he's accurate. No one's ever been able to say anything Aaron Mate has printed has been incorrect or propaganda. But go ahead.
Well, just in terms of the power dynamic at play here, none of this is transparent. We know this because Twitter changed ownership and we had some leaks. But this is the type of thing that apparently has been going on for a long time, that the FBI has been used as a proxy for various third parties, including the Secret Service of Ukraine, to crack down on its critics, including Americans. Mate, the former head of the Zinc network, or former official with the Zinc network, who helped organize these anti-disinformation think tanks and watchdog groups. He's at just a few months after this attempt through the FBI to censor Mate. He was the former official with the Zinc network was speaking at a conference and basically just openly saying that he'd like to censor Mate, that it's irresponsible for YouTube to host journalists like Russell Brand and like Aaron Mate and others. And so most of this is going on underground, behind closed doors, but occasionally they're saying it out in the open.
So when you talk about the Zinc network, so let me just show people. Immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, the USAID dispensed emergency grants to its media partners, partly through this thing called the Zinc network. That's a contractor based in London that has been accused of setting up covert public relation campaigns on behalf of the British government. Right. And so you're talking about this guy named Burley, right? And so
Ross Burley, yeah.
Yeah. And so he made out in public, he made statements saying that he thinks that media platforms need to be more responsible and take more responsible regarding what content they allow. And in fact, here's a quote. He said, "Even I saw Russell Brand, who has a huge following on YouTube, was interviewing a journalist called Aaron Mate on his channel. And he said it's incredibly irresponsible for YouTube and other social media companies to continue to host these people." So they want to just shut down U.S. and first of all, any voice, but especially United States journalists that were using U.S. money, and they're just saying it right out in the open. That's kind of the crazy part, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of surprised by this because, what drew me into journalism was the war in Iraq in 2003, seeing how much the traditional media, the legacy media, the big newspapers and broadcast television outlets were in lockstep with the Bush administration and driving the narrative for war. I thought the internet and social media would provide the necessary alternatives to question the foreign policy orthodoxy. In some cases that's true, but in other cases it's not. We've seen this kind of corralling of the internet that most major media relies on 3 or 4 social media platforms, video streaming sites. A lot of those have intricate links with the government, and they've done a very good job in marginalizing and really keeping dissenting views out of the public. And, just in terms of how the machinery works, consulting firms like Zinc Network mobilize these networks of NGOs and fact-checking organizations. Zinc Network, funded by the British government, funded by the State Department and U.S. military, they're helping set the discourse. They're working with this huge network of groups that are pressuring the social media platforms to remove dissenting speech and presenting the NATO viewpoint as the only acceptable viewpoint.
And we all remember that mental case, Nina Jankowicz. Remember when Biden appointed she's going to be his czar of disinformation. And then everybody just took a little peek into her background, and it turned out she's a full-blown mental case. Well, she actually works for this Zinc, for that Burley guy. She's a registered foreign lobbyist for Ross Burley's UK-based Center for Information Resilience. I mean, these are such Orwellian terms. It's amazing. And so, but they're also, these organizations supported by the U.S. government, they're also silencing critics, not only here in the United States, but inside Ukraine, correct?
Yeah, that's right. There's been a lot of changes to media law, a lot of very big policy efforts in Ukraine to silence the opposition over accusations of inappropriate Russian influence or Russian disinformation. Even preceding the current war, in 2021, Zelensky shut down 3 major television channels. He accused them of being tied to the Russian government, tied to his opposition in parliament, that were too close to the Russian government. This was criticized roundly by independent reporters, even by the UN. The United Nations put out a statement saying there's massive restrictions on free speech and free expression Ukraine, and some of the most problematic examples were these closures of television channels associated with the political opposition. Well, where does Zelensky find journalistic cover for these types of actions? There are a number of think tanks and watchdog groups and media outlets that are funded by the NED, by U.S. State Department, by USAID, American money, that provide them cover. They put out reports and press statements saying that Zelensky is doing the right thing. This is what all Western governments do. This is important for the fight against disinformation. And continuing through the war, after the war started, there were much more draconian steps. A big law in the end of 2022, the On Media Law, that officially bans hate speech and disinformation, but also gives a board controlled by Zelensky the unilateral power to ban any media, including online media, without a court order. Now, again, independent journalists from around the world criticized this law, but where did Zelensky and the Ukrainian government find cover to say, okay, this is actually supported by civil society and local journalists? Again, it's the same constellation of USAID, American-funded think tanks, media outlets, and watchdog groups. They put out statements. They lobbied the media. They were out in front giving Zelensky cover to pass these laws.
Well, here's another one of those media internews, right, that you've been just talking about, these organizations that give internews as a significant pillar in USAID's $35 million Ukraine media program. Other European governments and private sector donors led by billionaires like Pierre Omidyar. Now, where do I know that name from? Because he's the guy who owns The Intercept, which is why The Intercept, everything, just like when you read the New York Times or Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, you have to read The Intercept the same way. There might be some information in there, but you have to turn it sideways and you have to look it up, and they're all being biased because this guy's a big propagandist. And that's why the people who work for The Intercept currently can't tell you the truth about Russiagate, can't tell you the truth about the Ukraine war, couldn't tell you the truth about Syria. And so here they are back at. That's why The Intercept is garbage now, and mostly some good work, but mostly garbage. They're not as good as this show. I'll tell you that.
No, they're not.
Anyway, so they won't do this story, led by billionaire Pierre Omidyar via the Omidyar Network, and George Soros via the International Renaissance Foundation. They have financed the network of media and activists working with the USAID groups. And that you talked about this on media law that they passed in Ukraine, which it's, again, we just saw it in Scotland. They're using, so the new thing is to hate speech, right? So in the United States, I explained to people that all they have to do is, because we repealed habeas corpus, or Barack Obama, thank you, and so now all they have to do is say you're a terrorist, and they don't have to give you a speedy trial or even charge you with anything. They can lock you up with indefinite detention. And there's these hate crimes. Now so for instance, you can be called a terrorist if they say you're spreading misinformation. That's considered a cyber terrorist. So now you don't get any rights anymore. Now they can just and now they're doing hate crimes. So that's the new thing. If they say that you're saying something that stirs up bad feelings against a group of a protected group, that, and of course that's all intentionally vague. It's all left up to the interpretation of the government, which gives them a tool to silence and get rid of anybody who's their critic and telling the truth. And that's what the on media law did. And same thing's happening in Ukraine, right? And these are the people pushing that, giving cover for it. And here I just want to show you this, our last slide. The Columbia Journalism Review has chronicled the precarious situation independent journalists face in today's Ukraine. In January, a pair of thugs went to the home of Yuri Nikolaev, a prominent investigative journalist who has uncovered scandals involving military catering contracts, of all things. The men tried to break down his door, and according to his mother, who was home, called him a provocateur and a traitor. But it's much worse than that. Can you expand on some of that stuff that they're doing to journalists inside Ukraine?
Well, they're just being hounded by thugs and supposedly also the SBU, the intelligence agency. Some of these investigative journalists who are questioning the military contracts, questioning corruption in the Zelensky government, questioning a lot of the big policy choices he's made, whether on the battlefield or in terms of domestic politics, they've noticed on security cameras by their homes that they see these men basically following them, tracking them to their homes. They've identified some as actually working for the intelligence, the domestic intelligence agencies. So the apparatus of the state is being used against independent journalists. And it's very likely that some of these thugs, random people who are sending threats or actually showing up to attack journalists are also tied in with the government or government interests. So it's, if you look at the USAID contracts or the big reports from the State Department, they basically make the case that it's only Russia that's wiped out media freedom. Ukraine is a bastion for Western values and democracy, but the actual experience of journalists who are questioning the government, who are actually dissidents, is very different from what these reports claim in terms of the facts on the ground.
And so, when you hear the propaganda that you have to, democracy's on the ballot, and you have to vote for a certain political party, meaning the Democrats, to save democracy, that's just more disinformation and lies, because they're the same people funding these anti-democratic, anti-journalist, anti-free press, and they're using your own tax dollars against their own people. The enemy of the American people is, in fact, USAID, is, in fact, your own Congress and your own State Department and the Joe Biden. These people are not on our side. These people are on the sides of corporations, weapons manufacturers, oil companies, and other giant corporations. This, again, we don't live. Your democracy was stolen from you decades and decades ago. It didn't happen on January 6th. So, when you reading your piece, it was really amazing and eye-opening, and you really connect the dots on how this works. Does it? Do you have any hope left for the United States as an idea?
I mean, I do. I mean, I feel like it's a mix. USAID, and we might disagree here, and the U.S. government broadly in terms of foreign policy does some good, but it also does some bad, and it just deserves a lot of scrutiny. I just hate seeing, as a journalist, as a citizen, to see this like bandwagon effect where where when there's a war, when there's a conflict, when there's this kind of rush for emergency solutions, whether it's a pandemic or any of these other conflicts abroad, we see the suppression of free speech and free debate. We don't see questioning of big bureaucracies or billionaires or corporate interests. And here I'm just trying to balance the scales, because the more I look into this, and I want to do a lot of follow-ups, the more I kind of peel back the layers of the onion, the more I find that it's very troubling in terms of what we're doing in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, you make the point. Well, I'll make the point that everything we accuse Russia of doing is we're doing. The United States government is doing. Ukraine is doing, and I would say maybe even more so. So that's why it always, it gave me a chuckle when people would say, "Boy, that Putin, he's a thug, though, Jimmy. You gotta believe Putin's a thug." I'm like, oh yeah, remember when he killed 1 million people in Iraq, then went and turned Libya, the most successful country in Africa, into a failed state and bombed their water supply, and then did Syria so we could put a pipeline through, did 20 years of occupation. That Putin didn't do any of that. The United States is doing that. The United States is the world's terrorist, and nobody even comes close to our body count. Nobody even comes close to the countries we've overthrown, invaded, and undermined, and displaced people in. And right now we're occupying a third of Syria, which is right next to Ukraine. And nobody ever that ever comes up in the U.S. media. Isn't that weird? And which third of that country do you think that we're occupying? It's the part with the oil. That's the part. And so it's weird that it never comes up. Everything that you see the media claim other countries are doing, especially Russia, the United States are doing probably 10 times worse. That's my commentary. I don't want to put words.
I would just say it's not mutually exclusive. The U.S. has done a lot of wrong, done a lot of, arguably the term evil could be applied. So has Russia. I mean, a pox on both houses. I feel like it's probably my viewpoint on this whole debate.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you. They're all bad. They're all bad actors. But no one comes close to our body count, right? You can't disagree with that, can you?
In terms of broad numbers of people killed by foreign policy decisions over the last 20 years, no, the U.S. has killed more.
Yes, not even close. Well, Lee, I really appreciate you coming on. Everybody should check out this article and check out your Substack. You do great work over there. I appreciate you making time for us today. Anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
No, I just really appreciate the invitation, and yeah, check out the Substack. I rely on independent-minded supporters and subscriptions, so really appreciate it.
Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, Cortland, New York, Oakmont, Pennsylvania, El Paso, Texas, San Antonio, Texas, Vancouver, British Columbia. First show sold out. Denver, Colorado, Ashland, Virginia, Athens, Georgia, and Minneapolis. We're coming back to Minneapolis. If you couldn't get tickets last time, there'll be some available this time. We're doing 2 shows. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets.